Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the NSRP Subcommittee hearing on the National Endowment for Democracy. Our witness today is Damon Wilson, President and CEO of NED. Thank you, Mr. Wilson, for agreeing to testify here today. It should be no surprise to anyone why the subcommittee's first hearing of the year is to discuss oversight of the National Endowment for Democracy. At this moment in our country's history, under the tremendous leadership of President Trump, our foreign policy has been awakened and strengthened in an unprecedented manner. And the work of NED is critical. It's a critical tool advancing the foreign policy priorities of the administration, including by defending international religious freedom in places like Nigeria, Nicaragua, and Communist China, and supporting those struggling for freedom in places like Iran and North Korea and Cuba, just to name a few. But just as important as the president is what's going to happen in the future, what may happen in the future. Foreign policy changes from one administration to the next. We know that happens. Yet the work of NED remains consistent. As many of you know, I'm a strong proponent of democracy and of human rights and of promotion of those things as a fundamental part of our foreign policy and our national security. Towards that goal, the NED and accountable democracy programs in general are essential to countering adversaries, advancing American national security interests, and standing with those struggling for freedom, regardless of who is in the White House. Now, NED was Ronald Reagan's idea, and was founded through an act of Congress in the 1980s to counter the then evil empire of the Soviet Union. From its inception, it has enjoyed strong bipartisan support due to its uncontroversial mission of promoting freedom, often within our most dangerous adversaries. Now, obviously, it worked pretty well, right? As most of Eastern Europe is made up of free, independent countries that are among some of our closest, strongest allies. So while the Soviet Union no longer exists, threats to freedom and our security remain, and frankly have evolved significantly since then. NED has adopted to be responsive to those emerging trends and threats. They work in some of the most dangerous and adversarial nations like Iran, like China. They've also been laying the groundwork for peace and stability in places like the South Caucasus, which provides an opening for initiatives like the Trump route for international peace and prosperity, connecting Armenia and Azerbaijan. Man, easy for me to say. That's right. So yes, let's be clear. NED has made mistakes in the past, but to NED's credit, they are extremely responsive and quick to recognize and rectify those mistakes. For example, when they found a problematic issue with a grantee, they resolved it in a matter of days. They canceled it outright, and got the money back. I wish that every other federally funded organization was that swift and that responsive to Congress and to when they make mistakes. So part of that responsiveness is the close engagement between NED and the United States Congress. We continue that today with this oversight hearing to ask the tough questions and make sure that NED is carrying out its work, which is so critical to furthering U.S. national security interests. Mr. Wilson, again, thanks for being here. I look forward to discussing these critical issues with you further. Let me now turn to my Florida colleague and friend, the ranking member, for her opening statement. You're recognized.
Thank you. Well, I want to start, but first of all, good to be with you. And I was a little late because I was picking up an award from my chairman, which I'm going to present to you right now, from Malaria No More. We're fighting malaria together here.
Great. Thank you.
Enjoy it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's cool.
And I'm glad I learned.
I'm not going to take any of your time for that.
No. Well, I learned about the Trump route from you today. Okay. So thank you. This is a very mostly bipartisan committee, and we're very collegiate, and it's a pleasure. And thank you for being here, Mr. Wilson. So this hearing is really, I know we're going to talk about your organization, but it's more than that. It's whether the United States will continue to lead with strength, transparency, and principle in supporting democratic institutions and defenders around the world. Supporting the National Endowment for Democracy is one of the ways we carry out this mission. And thank you for your leadership. The NID was created by Congress, as my colleague has said, in 1983 during the Cold War, at a time when Congress made a deliberate choice. If the United States is going to support democratic movements abroad, we should do it openly, transparently, and through civilian institutions, not covertly. And the NID was designed to strengthen the institutions that now allow societies to resolve conflict peacefully, free and fair elections, independent media, accountable governments, rule of law, labor rights, and private enterprise. Sometimes we say it's wishful thinking, right? It operates as an independent, congressionally funded nonprofit, receiving annual appropriations through this subcommittee, but intentionally separate from the State Department. And that independence gives it credibility abroad and reinforces congressional oversight at home. And it does it through 4 core institutes. And the NED supports civil society in more than 90 countries. I hope that's still true. The work is not abstract. It supports election observers who deter fraud, journalists who expose corruption, and labor leaders who defend workers' rights. And women, I'm going to stress this, women who run for office in places where their participation was once unthinkable. And in places like Ukraine, where organizations that document war crimes, so maybe one day we can have accountability. And these efforts help prevent fragile societies from descending into violence. And supporters of NED, and as I said, it's bipartisan, have understood a simple truth. Strong democratic institutions reduce instability, they reduce extremism, they reduce the likelihood that American troops will be called upon later. And I will tell you that, and I've said this so many times at this meeting, as a mother of a United States Marine War veteran, I take this lesson very, very personally. The conflicts that cost American lives and taxpayer dollars often emerge when democracy is weak or absent, and supporting democratic institutions is not just a charity, it is a prevention. It's for our own national security, and it's cost effective. The resources we devote to democracy support are a fraction of what we spend when instability turns into war, mass displacement, or humanitarian crisis. Now, we know, we've heard the critics who argue that democracy promotion interferes in sovereign affairs or advances U.S. geopolitical interests. But NED's work, which is independent, it's transparent, it's congressionally authorized, and rooted in universal principles, accountable government, rule of law, and the right of people to shape their own future. And that is something that we are clear about. So from Tehran to Moscow to Beijing to Caracas, authoritarian regimes are tightening their grip. They're jailing journalists, they're silencing opposition voices, and they're hollowing out civil society and actively working to undermine the norms worldwide. And so we cannot step back. Retreat doesn't create stability, and that's why efforts to scale back election monitoring weaken the State Department's Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau. Rose, I hope you're going to talk about that. She doesn't know. Okay. Anyway, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter this into the fact sheet from NED's core institutes, the National Democratic, just the core institutes, and
Without objection.
you know that. Okay?
Without objection.
And last one thing, I know you want me to wrap up here. I want to address the constitutional dimension, which is we appropriate the funds for NED because we have determined that the work advances American interests. The power of the purse rests with Congress, and when congressionally appropriated funds are delayed or withheld without clear legal basis, it raises serious concerns. really be interested in your take on that. It's, Mr. Wilson, I look forward to hearing you. And again, everybody here who's here today supporting democracy, I thank you very much. And I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you. It's now my pleasure to recognize the ranking member of the full Committee of Appropriations, Mr. Laura.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. I want to start by, you saw the presentation of the award, but I want to express my appreciation for the bipartisan work that Chairman Diaz-Balart and Ranking Member Frankel have. The relationship has been proved to accomplish much on this subcommittee, especially as it relates to the National Endowment for Democracy, or the NED. I'm very proud they were able to come together earlier this year on a funding bill that rejects the cuts to the NED, sending a strong signal to this White House and to the world that the United States Congress remains committed. We are committed to supporting democracy around the globe. I thank you, Mr. Wilson, for answering the questions before the subcommittee today. I thank you for the work that you do as president and CEO of the endowment. And if you'll indulge me for a second, I see in the audience a young man who I worked with for years when I first came to the Congress, and that's Jerry Hartz, who's with NDI, and we conspired and did many things together, including helping to bring about the end of the war in Nicaragua. So hats off, Jerry. All around the world, the National Endowment for Democracy provides indispensable support for advocates of the essential freedoms that we cherish here at home: freedom of speech, the press, religion, assembly, the freedom to choose our leaders, chase our dreams without the fear of oppression. In 2024 alone, the NED made over 1,900 grants across 91 countries, providing over $286 million in aid to organizations that work to advance democracy from the bottom up, and oftentimes risking their lives to do so. They are in dangerous areas. Sometimes we lose sight of that in the United States, of how dangerous the situations are that people that we send there are and what their environment is all about. Because we believe that we have a safe environment here in which to conduct our democracy, and we need to keep it so. Groups backed by the NED have been instrumental in documenting the Chinese Communist Party's persecution of religious minorities, reporting on mass internment camps, abuse of Muslim women for wearing hijabs, and the imprisonment of Christian leaders. In Sudan, groups that received support from the NED bore witness to the atrocities committed during the ongoing civil war and were key to the U.S. government's determination last year that the rapid support forces are committing genocide. And in Russia, where Putin's regime has imprisoned countless dissidents for no crime other for their beliefs, the NED was able to sustain legal support and advocacy for over 1,500 political prisoners. These are brave men and women. They stand up for their own freedom and for that of their country, carry forward the hope that is the foundation of any democracy. Unfortunately, the world is experiencing a resurgence of autocracy and authoritarianism, making support for freedom and democracy around the globe more important than ever. And as the world's wealthiest and most powerful democracy, we have an obligation to set an example here at home. We must model the values and practices that we push for internationally: free and fair elections, due process, and the rule of law, essential inviolable rights that protect our most essential freedoms. Sadly, this administration has set the wrong example and has modeled behavior we would historically have condemned had it occurred in another country. The president last week attacked in personal terms several Supreme Court justices for blocking his illegal taxes on American consumers, preventing him from raising costs on working families even more than he already has. Since President Trump took office, this administration has routinely ignored court orders, prompting judges across the country to threaten government lawyers with contempt for their abject failure to comply with the law. And just this week, President Trump revived his big lie that the 2020 election was stolen when it was not. This lie led to the greatest assault on American democracy since the Civil War, the insurrection of January 6th. I believe that America is exceptional, that we are the greatest nation on earth, and we can achieve anything that we set our minds to if we put our differences aside and pursue it together. In a much narrower sense, the work of this subcommittee is evidence of that we can bridge our differences for the common good. But this exceptionalism comes with responsibility. Through our actions, we can either lend credibility to the corruption and oppression of dictatorships or the abundance and freedom of democracy. It is my hope that through the good work of independent organizations like the NED, the United States may be able to reclaim some of the credibility this administration has squandered overseas. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson, your full written statement will be placed on the records. Obviously, feel free to summarize your testimony. You're now recognized, sir.
Chairman Diaz-Balart, Ranking Member Franco, Ranking Member DeLauro, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. On behalf of our bipartisan board, our vice chairman and chair who are with us, our staff, our remarkable staff, the core institutes, and thousands of Democratic partners, we thank Congress for its bipartisan support and leadership in advancing freedom as a national security priority for our nation. I also want to thank the chair, both ranking members, and all of the committee for their strong support during the last appropriation process. We do not take that support for granted, and that's why we welcome today's hearing. So more than 4 decades ago, President Ronald Reagan called for investing in fostering the infrastructure of democracy, the institutions, civic organizations, and free media that allow societies to govern themselves. In 1983, Congress answered that call with the bipartisan NED Act, authorizing a public-private partnership to advance America's interests by supporting democracy abroad. And we were joined in that effort by the core institutes, the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, Center for International Private Enterprise, and the Solidarity Center. Today, our mandate is urgent. Authoritarian regimes are coordinated, technologically capable, and aggressive in stifling freedom at home and exporting repression across borders. We see this in Russia's unjust war against Ukraine, as today marks the 4th year of the full-scale invasion. Backed by Chinese technology, Iranian drones, and North Korean and Cuban combatants, Vladimir Putin aims to extinguish the appeal of liberty at home by ensuring that it does not flourish in Ukraine. NED's work helps Ukrainians hold the line against Kremlin aggression. NED counters America's rivals by helping partners build effective democracies and protect fundamental freedoms. Despite intensifying repression, citizens are standing up for their rights, from Iran and Venezuela to Cuba and across Africa. In freer societies, there are strategic opportunities to strengthen democratic institutions and free enterprise, as we see in Moldova, Armenia, and Kenya, and Bolivia. Young people are insisting on better futures, turning to technology to assert their voice and hold governments accountable. And all of this underscores a central truth. The demand for freedom is universal and persistent. But as President Reagan said, it requires sustained backing. Supporting those who seek freedom is a strategic investment in U.S. national and economic security. Where democratic institutions and free markets are weak, conflict, drug and human trafficking, terrorism, refugee flows, and coercive economic practices take root. Where citizens have a say in their future, societies are more stable partners for the United States. NED advances this mission by stewarding taxpayer resources with discipline. 84 cents of every dollar goes directly to the front lines, making NED one of the most cost-effective national security investments. Last year, we delivered $271 million for more than 1,500 projects in 90 countries. And 86% of our grants to grassroots organizations are under $150,000. We know exactly where that money goes. Our credibility rests on a commitment to transparency, accountability, and nonpartisanship. We submit spending plans and annual reports and consult with Congress and the administration. We provide grant and financial reporting to the State Department and respond promptly to oversight requests. NED is also subject to independent audits, GAO and State Inspector General oversight, and FOIA. We publicly disclose grants while protecting partners. Our programmatic priorities advance freedom in areas that are central to U.S. interests. Our work provides a counterweight to China's authoritarian reach. NED-supported researchers exposed more than 100 CCP police stations across 53 countries working to silence dissidents. Our partners document CCP re-education camps, Uyghur forced labor, and boarding schools seeking to erase Tibetan culture and faith. NED partners defend freedom of speech and belief. In Nigeria, partners document attacks on faith communities and pursue justice through the courts. In North Korea, our partners pierce authoritarian censorship. In countries that are emerging from conflict or authoritarian rules, such as Bangladesh or Syria, we help translate political openings into durable institutions. Our work advances economic security by bolstering transparency and rule of law, reducing corruption, and promoting fair competition that benefits American workers and businesses. In Bolivia, NED partners help prevent the world's largest lithium deposits from falling under Moscow's and Beijing's control. As the United States approaches its 250th anniversary, we're reminded that our nation was founded on a universal idea, that liberty belongs to all. Congress created NED to advance that idea through partnership with those seeking freedom in their own societies. At a moment of geopolitical competition, supporting democracy and freedom is not only consistent with our values, it strengthens America's security, prosperity, and global leadership. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I will. Sure. Thank you. I will call on members, as usual, folks, based on seniority to those that were present when we gavelled the hearing, alternating between each side. Each member will have 5 minutes for questions and answer. But I anticipate that we should have 2 rounds, which is great. So we'll start the clock with me as well. You mentioned Nigeria in your opening statement. Yesterday, I went to the White House to deliver the Appropriations Committee report requested by the President on the persecution of Christians in Nigeria. Some of us traveled there. And Ned and the courts have been on this issue for quite some time, and you actually mentioned Nigeria in your opening statement. Will you please share more about Ned's work in Nigeria? What actually is happening there with you all?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nigeria is NED's largest program in Africa, and I think that reflects its strategic significance to freedom as well across the continent, as well as to U.S. interests. In fact, my first trip as NED president to Africa was to Nigeria for that reason. So, as you know very well, the administration recently designated Nigeria as a country of particular concern. NED has been supporting this work by bringing together Nigerian partners, for example, at the International Religious Freedom Summits in Nairobi, as well as here in Washington, to help provide a sense of ground truth about what's happening, connecting the stakeholders on the grounds with the advocates. And we brought a community of our organizations together in February to talk about these issues here in Washington. If you think about how in Nigeria, our partners have been able to argue that religious freedom challenges are tied to the governance failures that you probably saw in your visit as well. Failures to provide security, uphold rule of law, respect broader rights. And by ensuring the Nigerian government's more accountable to the Nigerian people, how to help our partners advance the protection of religious freedom. So across the country, we're investing about $5 million. Our core institutes are there, 16 projects, a real target to the Middle Belt where where the particular violence against religious communities is taking place, in a way that now enables citizens to defend their rights, especially freedom of expression and belief, but also to strengthen their participation in politics and governance, to help build, I think, a more competitive and democratic electoral system where we've seen some real challenges as Nigeria has gone through its elections. And so in the aggregate, this work comes at the issues of religious freedom directly by supporting issues of security and governance failures in the country as well.
So let me ask you this, and this really kind of applies almost system-wide. How do you protect local partners and those individuals that are doing some, frankly, delicate work or dangerous work in delicate places from retaliation while still maintaining transparency. How do you do that? How can you do that? And what lessons have you learned from past program failures? Because or even security breaches.
Mr. Chairman, that's an extremely important question for the way the endowment operates. For us, we think of the transparency, accountability, nonpartisanship. These are foundational principles for the endowment, but they're also really embedded practices. At the same time, we marry that with a duty of care to ensure that those partners that are working on behalf of their fundamental freedoms are protected. And as you can imagine, this work is particularly challenging in a place like Cuba and China or Russia. This work is the kind of work that can end up getting folks not just harassed, intimidated, but imprisoned, and in some cases face consequences of death. I think one of the challenges we have had in this new environment is that even in places that were once considered open, we've seen challenges arise for partners. Tunisia, after the Arab Spring, a very open society, and yet we've seen a crackdown on partners that really were operating completely transparently, publicly, with NED's support. We've seen the same play out in Georgia. I was faced with a challenge when I came to the endowment that all of our partners in Ukraine operated very openly. Everything was public. And yet on the eve of the invasion, we were briefed by officials that our NED partners were on, quote, kill and capture lists that the Russians maintained. And in the event of an occupation of Ukraine, that our partners would be targeted. We saw that in the opening days of the war. A partner in Kherson who had fled his apartment as Russian forces entered that southern city in Ukraine. And he left cameras in his apartment. And days later, it filmed baklava-covered, face mask-covered Russian forces busting down the doors to their apartment, coming to seek to hold them accountable. So what we tried to do, Mr. Chairman, is lean in on the transparency that we are committed to do with Congress and the administration. We do that in real practice by submitting detailed annual spending plans. How are we going to spend the funds that are appropriated? By providing an annual report to the executive branch and Congress that then explains where those funds went, the impact of those funds, provides a full grant listings. We provide monthly obligations of our grant payments to the State Department as well as quarterly financial reports. And we consult regularly both with the State Department and with Congress on our programs, on our priorities. And on top of that, I think we welcome oversight hearings. We are responsive when members have questions or administration officials. We've provided over 22,000 pages in documents to the latest request of information from the State Department, for example. We also have built into the statute our responsiveness to the State Inspector General, to Freedom of Information Act, to GAO review of the work that we undertake. And we submit independent audits that we go through to the State Department for review as well.
Let me cut you off there.
Please.
By the way, impressive answer, all these measures that you've been taking, but I want to keep myself to as much as possible the time. To the ranking member, of course, you recognize that.
Thank you very much. I want to talk to you about the women of the world. Women are often the key to ensuring long-lasting and resilient democracies, and countries where women doing well tend to be countries with fair elections, vibrant civil societies, and independent and accountable institutions. Well, I guess I make it. You agree, I guess. You'll shake your head yes. All right. That's not the question, though.
Yes, Madam Chair. Thank you, member.
So one of the many casualties of the Foreign Assistance Review by the Trump administration, programs centered on the unique role of women in society, economy, or political life were terminated across USAID, the state's DRL Bureau, and the Office of Global Women's Issues. So what I would like for you to do first is if you could comment on how empowering women is connected to democracy. Tell us about maybe some of the programs you are involved in that regard, and what concerns should we have, if you have an opinion, in terms of the United States terminating some of the programs?
Thank you for that question. I'd say the concept of NED support for women is really political participation. It's part of our broader mission to ensure that strengthened democratic institutions reflect their people, ensure equal access to civic life and public life for all citizens. And so our work focuses on expanding opportunities for women that involve and get involved in public affairs and public life, civil society, media, and governance. You may have participated in programs, leadership programs that IRI and NDI often run with women parliamentarians. But we do this in a way that is reflective of how the endowment operates, appropriate for local context, what is appropriate in that culture, the demand that comes from those societies. So if you think about it, this leads to work where our partners are helping criminalizing violence against women in societies, working for their inclusion in public governance and oversight. SIPE and Solidarity are involved in women's business associations and the economic opportunities for them as well. There's a way to think about this in a country like Morocco that had a relatively new constitution, yet a family code that was really outdated. We have a partner there, Manasset, that really worked with a coalition of civil society groups with the government to update the family code, getting 19 reforms passed through a pretty laborious process that had a fundamental impact on the lived experience of women in society, consistent with the Constitution, by giving them rights to inheritance, to custody, to guardianship, and freedom of movement. That's the type of partnership, the type of work that the endowment helps support.
Okay, thank you. Do you do any, I'm just curious, do you do any work to try to stop genital mutilation in the world?
I don't know specifically the answer to that, so I can come back to you on the
Okay.
details, but we have strong programs across Africa that involve women's leadership rights and participation, so I'll come back to you with a specific answer on that.
And what, it's just from your observation, what are the major risks that the women that you're working with are facing?
So in many places, we see that part of this has been having a seat at the table, whether in political parties and public parliaments, having a voice in shaping policies that impact them. In other cases, we've seen there are real challenges to security, to personal well-being. We've seen, for example, in China, a targeting of Uyghur women through sterilization practices to have an actual impact on the demographic composition of the populations of Western China, of Xinjiang. So it really ranges depending on the openness of the environment and the closed nature of that. But it's been, I think, a fundamental issue both in our support for democracy and in challenging authoritarian repression of half of their society.
What about sexual assault as a tool of war?
This has been a big issue across our programs in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I've had a chance to visit with some of our partners in Eastern Congo, Southern Congo.
What do the programs do?
You may know Denis Mukwege, who is one of our partners in the DRC, one of the Nobel Peace Prize winners who is part of our portfolio. And part of what he has done is help treat and help communities prepare to help women that have been abused by sexual violence in the conflict in Eastern Congo. But I think more than that, we're not a humanitarian organization. We have groups that are working in communities to help raise awareness, to help stigmatize the practice of doing this in Congo, to create a sense of documentation of this so that there is an accountability, and to create resilience both among women's groups, but also among communities to support those who have been victimized by this violence. So the endowment comes at it not just from a humanitarian perspective, we come at it from a democracy, fundamental freedoms, and governance perspective.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Scamani, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for being here with us and answering our questions, and thank you for coming today. I'm going to get right to it. We have a short period of time, so hopefully we can get through a lot of these questions, and I know we have a second round. But I want to say a core criticism that I've heard from my constituents on this is that they feel that funding soft power initiatives like NED and has not resulted in the geopolitical landscape more favorable to the U.S. interest. Right now, with your questions and testimony here today, I hope we can help alleviate relevant criticisms about why continuing to fund that has been a bipartisan priority on that, and why it aligns with, it can align, if done properly, with newly affirmed and streamlined national security priorities by the Trump administration, and how that's aligning itself to that. So let me get to my first question. In light of this reality, how do you measure progress? How do you measure success on the funds that are given, and what metrics do you use? If you can be specific here, and this is why I'm saying this, because in your testimony you specifically emphasize how NED is one of the most cost-effective long-term investments the United States can make in global stability, and specifically highlighted the countries that you fund these programs, like China, like Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, You mentioned Russia as well. As I see it, these countries for decades have seen little to no progress in democratic reform and have only recently actually have been seeing regime change when our military has gotten involved with pressure from the current administration. Furthermore, we have only seen democratic progress in or around China decrease, actually, with Hong Kong being a prime example for that. So I'm not seeing a trend specifically in these countries of progress. Can you share with us how you measure progress and what metrics you use?
Thank you very much for the question. I think it's an important issue to consider. The way we think about impact depends on how we define success. And so we'll do this at the level of an actual grant to make sure that an investment, a particular investment, is producing results at a country level or portfolio level, as well as thinking about it more broadly. And so let me just take a minute to explain that. So at the grant level, we will look and see what the benchmarks of what was set out to be achieved with that grant and how it delivered results. So in very specific cases, we can see that $115,000 has led to an effort that revealed a CCP police station in Manhattan, has documented that, led to actions. We can see that partners in a place like China have actually helped build an effort to repeal a type of prolonged pretrial detention that had a palpable impact that was used and weaponized against political activists in the country. We'll also look at it at a portfolio level. And so you can think over time, you're right, in China today, if you're a Uyghur, you're in a very difficult situation. And yet when the endowment gave its first grants, very modest grants to the Uyghur community, they were either unknown globally or believed to be China's Muslim terrorists. In part with modest endowment support over years, we've helped give the Uyghur community its voice by being able to document what's happening to them in the country, putting pressure on the regime to address that behavior, and giving them a sense of human dignity in pursuing that.
I'm sorry to interrupt because we're running out of time.
Sure.
So what results have we seen in examples like that one? I get the process, but what have we seen? And then on top of that, you mentioned the grantees, and why is the grantee list still private? It's always, is it always been that way, or how often do you find grantees that are not using tax dollars to their best of the effectiveness that they could be using it? So now that you mentioned that, and I got 1:20 left, so if you can take that time to answer, what the exact progress that we've seen. I get the process, but also why is the grantee list private?
Sure. So in the Uyghur case, for example, it did lead to extensive genocide designations about what was happening in Uyghur, really raising the cost for the PRC, the CCP's behavior. We've seen in other areas of support where former military dictatorships with support of our core institutes have become strong democratic allies of the United States, being able to contribute much more to U.S. national security.
Like which one?
If you think historically about what happened from Chile, the Philippines, across Central and Eastern Europe, this was support that the endowment also helped provide in these transitions to consolidate their democracies. More recently, in a country like Moldova and Bolivia, which have come through very contested elections where we saw Bolivia slipping into authoritarianism or Moldova subject potentially to Russian influence and domination, the work of the endowment has helped local partners be able to defend their own democracy through strengthening their democratic institutions and through electoral processes. I think your point on the privacy, on the public disclosure of partners is very important. We publish our grants publicly twice a year. We do provide, at the request, we provide with the administration, often in briefings on Congress, the specific names and organizations that we will work with. Our board is privy to all of that. But we, twice a year, publish a grant listings of all of our grants, the activities that they undertake, without the personal identifying information. What we adapted was a few years ago, frankly, it was in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where we used to try to say, these are closed, these are dangerous environments, these are more open environments. What happened is, formerly open environments, whether Tunisia or Ukraine, became quite dangerous for those names of the organizations that were out there. So publicly, we don't disclose their information. We disclose the grant, the amount, where it goes, what the activities are. And privately, we maintain full transparency with our board, with Capitol Hill, with the executive branch as well. This is a way to balance our duty of care as well as our commitment to transparency. We have devolved, and many of these grantees, in their own right, disclose their relationship with the endowment, are proud of that, and make that very much public. In other places, as you can imagine, in Nicaragua or North Korea, these are the types of things that our grantees need to be able to protect.
Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wilson, we're all familiar with Secretary Mattis' quote that if you don't fully fund the State Department, you better buy me more ammunition. Your thoughts on investing in civil society, the rule of law, and democratic accountability, and how that reduces the likelihood of state collapse, migration, extremism, or conflict that could ultimately require U.S. military intervention. And the professor in me says, please include in your answer the role of cuts to USAID and the U.S. role in the world and the threats of conflict.
Thank you for your question. This is why we fundamentally see the work that we do to support democracy and freedom as fundamental to America's national security interest. The issues that bedevil, as members of Congress, this committee, issues that stem from conflict, from refugee flows, illegal migration, from illegal drug trafficking, human trafficking, these are real issues that are threats to our society. The investments that the endowment makes complement other tools of America's foreign policy to help ensure that societies have the ability to resolve these issues themselves, that we support those that take the initiative to solve problems in their own societies. And when they succeed, it becomes very good for us. It helps resolve conflicts peacefully. It gives people a stake in their local communities so that they don't feel that they have a reason to have to leave because of persecution or lack of opportunity. And so in many respects, the investments that the endowment make at the support for democratic institutions, for inclusive governments, responsive to their peoples, is really a means to help ensure that those challenges and threats don't face the American people. I think this is an important contribution to American national security and economic security.
Again, just to get full credit for your answer, USAID, how that is specifically played a role, and what, if anything, are you hearing from our NGOs, allies, and others of how this has impacted the U.S. status in the world and local security issues?
Look, a fundamental difference is USAID had a broad development set of responsibilities and priorities that it had to address. The endowment has a narrow focus on freedom and democracy. In some cases that overlapped, we could see in the
They have to be interconnected, though.
We could see in the role of elections and other areas there was an important role that AID played at that moment. But we also saw the foundational effort that in the absence of having accountability, addressing corruption, having responsive government, that many investments that you can make across other humanitarian and development aspects could be put at risk without the foundational issues of rule of law, of accountability. And so really there's a synergy there between ensuring that we're helping provide that fundamental democratic accountability. If you think about our work across Latin America or Ukraine, it has helped Ukrainians or Latin Americans ensure that assistance or ensure that public expenditures are not wasted or stolen, but are used for those intentional purposes. And I think that has been sort of the connections that's been quite important. Where we've noticed the biggest impact for us, where we've had to focus, is funding around elections. The endowment has emerged as a significant supporter of elections globally. We weren't in that position previously, as well as in support for independent media.
Very good. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Edwards, the Vice Chairman of the Subcommittee, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Wilson, thanks for being with us this morning. Are you familiar with a Heritage Foundation report titled "The Undemocratic National Endowment for Democracy Needs Oversight and Reform"?
Yes, sir, I am.
I'd like to ask a couple of questions stemming from that report. It recommends folding NED funding into the State Department, arguing that the endowment duplicates existing democracy assistance functions. Can you explain to this panel how NED's private grant-making model differs operationally and legally from the state programming, particularly in politically sensitive environments where the United States government branding could be counterproductive, and whether consolidation would reduce flexibility or effectiveness?
Thank you for that question. Part of the mandate that we follow, created by Congress, was to do this work of support for democracy and freedom through private means of private support for private actors around the world in a way that was consistent with and complemented U.S. foreign policy, but was supplemental and complementary. And so in many respects, I would argue that we very much do not duplicate. We don't undertake foreign policy. We consult with state. We consult with the Hill on these programs. But we remain focused on our congressional mission, which is to support fundamental freedoms and democratic rights. And so if you think about the way we operate, it's really built not on big projects or not for complicated foreign policy goals that we may need to be tracking, which involve a military agreement, a trade agreement. The endowment has a laser focus on the congressional support for fundamental freedoms. And what this allows us to do is to support American interests over the long term in a way that supplements and complements other tools that the United States has in its foreign policy toolkit. You can think about this in a couple of ways that how it complements sanctions policy, security assistance, diplomacy, by what we do on strengthening transparency, democratic institutions. And we've seen at times real complementary work. In Ukraine, our work has helped ensure that American support on the defense side has not gone to has exposed corruption and helped protect American investment. We've seen this in places historically, even where the fact of Ned's private support, for example, in a place like Cuba, allowed us to maintain our work in supporting Cuban dissidents, even when a previous administration was engaged in talks with the regime in Havana about restoring diplomatic relations, requesting that Ned, IRI, NDI, that our programs cease in Cuba. We were able to continue those, I think, at an important time, reflecting how it can complement American foreign policy, continue to advance our interests, and doing that in full consultation with Congress and the administration.
Thank you. We're going to run out of time. I've got many questions. Let me squeeze this one in, though. That same report alleges a number of programs from the National Endowment of Democracy might not be fully supporting an American First agenda. Can you tell me what is the process for terminating or restructuring a program that you might discover does not support America First? And how do you make Congress aware of those situations?
Thank you for that question. I think it's important. The chairman referenced this in the opening, and I'll pick up on that we have a flexibility and agility. We work through every grant that goes through quite a bit of vetting and due diligence that is approved by our board, that is briefed to the Hill, that is shared with the administration. When we determine that there is something that we're concerned of, information that came to light, we have the ability to act quickly and suspend immediately. So the chairman referred to one of these, an example related to the Global Disinformation Index, in which Heritage has asserted that we have censored. I would argue that NED does not censor Americans' free speech, never has supported efforts to suppress or defund media outlets. When we learn, for example, of an organization that using the funds of another donor did a work on the United States on the U.S. media environment in a way that was inconsistent with the NED mandate, when I became aware of that, we halted the grant immediately. We ordered a review, did an internal review, terminated that relationship, clawed back the unspent funds, and briefed both Congress and our board all within a week, bringing that issue to light ourselves to acknowledge what had happened and how we dealt with it, rather than waiting to be told how to address it. I think that's an attitude and approach we bring. We understand that supporting freedom and democracy, particularly in closed environments, repressive environments, this is complicated. This can be difficult work. We need to be able to take prudent risks on behalf of freedom fighters that are taking a lot of courageous acts. But we have to be able to have the mechanisms to realize this hasn't either worked out or it's gone in a direction, there's other work involved that is just inconsistent with how we would operate, and we can rectify that immediately and brief that out to Congress.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Molinar, I'm privileged to have the chairman of the China Task Force on this subcommittee. You're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wilson, thank you for being here with us today. Just to follow up on some of the issues that you were talking about, when you came in this leadership role with NED, NED had previously funded the Global Disinformation Index. It's a group that effectively blacklisted conservative news outlets in the United States. Could you describe what changes you've made to ensure that taxpayer dollars are not suppressing Americans' free speech?
Thank you for the question. As I said, the endowment does not censor Americans' free speech. We have never supported any work that suppresses or defunds U.S. media outlets, conservative or otherwise. We don't fund any programs that are focused on the United States by statute. Our work is solely focused on what happens around the world, overseas. This is an example, the grant you referenced was an example that was work focused on how to research the vulnerabilities that were taking place in foreign media markets, and it included efforts of China's efforts to distort information abroad, to bring propaganda into these media markets. So the endowment never funded this organization's work related to the United States, related to audiences in the United States, any of that. But as I said, when we became aware that work undertaken on the United States funded by another donor, inconsistent with our mandate, we acted immediately. We halted the grant, we ordered a review, we terminated the relationship, we clawed back the remaining funds, and we briefed our board. We took the initiative to brief Congress on that issue, and we did a review of our work to ensure that safeguards were in place so that we had a perspective on what are the activities of the partners that we support that we may not be funding, but other activities that we would be concerned would make them inappropriate as partners for U.S. public taxpayer funds.
Thank you. And as you pointed out now, when President Reagan and Congress envisioned NED, it would be to be a nonpartisan institution. Can you describe the board, the staff? Is it 50-50, Republican, Democrat? How would you describe that?
So our board, by statute and by practice, is a balanced among Democrats and Republicans, includes business and labor representatives. We're pleased that across the boards of NED and the Core Institute, there are 10 members of Congress that serve. We welcome your honorary membership of our board as well. And so for the endowment, our chairman, Peter Roscom, a former House Republican member of Congress, reflecting the party that controls the presidency. We have 3 former members of the Trump administration that serve on our board. We take that seriously. The board has a governance process. The board itself ensures that it is politically balanced. For our staff, we are laser focused on expertise. We have a merit-based talent strategy that looks for the best experts that understand the realities happening on the ground in countries around the world. We have a very professional staff, a very public way of thinking about how we recruit that talent based on people that are driven by the mission, that bring expertise, allow us to speak 45 languages. And I think that combination of a structure that is by definition built as a bipartisan entity, and yet with a mission and a team that is by definition through nonpartisan execution, that's what gives us the credibility and I think the legitimacy to work on behalf of the American people, but also to do our work around the world.
Speaking of your work around the world, you know, if my constituents were to ask me $315 million going to NED, how does that support U.S. national security interests as well as the interests of people in my home state of Michigan?
Thank you for the question. I think about this in 2 ways. My grandmother worked in a textile mill in North Carolina, and I used to have to talk to her about what I did. And I would go both ways. She's very patriotic. And we would talk about how our country is exceptional, it's great because of our people, the economy, our military, our geography. But one of the most powerful things that she understood, a woman who wasn't very educated, was that what inspired our country 250 years ago is what inspires people around the world. The ideals of human dignity, of freedom, of democratic responsibility. And that fact is what helps make us great and powerful. I think President Reagan saw this and understanding in the Cold War. This is one of the parts of what allowed us to win the Cold War without fighting. But I can also bring it home for my uncle, who's a veteran, a little bit more pragmatic, to address the issues that you might hear from constituents, that it really does matter for our national security and economic security, that the issues that we have to deal with, conflicts, refugee flows, migration, diseases, drugs, terrorism, I think the American people have painfully learned which happens overseas doesn't always stay there, whether it's in Caracas or Kabul. They have felt the consequences in their communities. And so I think the way we think about this work, how we prevent instability and conflict and migration pressures before they become threats, and very expensive threats to the United States. But it's also fundamental to how American firms and businesses can compete. Often in your district, they depend on these overseas markets. The work we do ensures that American workers are not undercut by slave labor, and American firms have a level playing field in which they can compete. And I think that can bring it home to why this is a dollar for value focused on delivering for the American people.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Alford, you're recognized, sir.
Well, thank you, Chairman Diaz-Balart and Ranking Member Frankel, for this hearing today. President Trump and Secretary Rubio have ushered in a new golden era of America First foreign policy. They've moved away from the old State Department mindset, one that too often focused on so-called global interests rather than American interests. American taxpayers should not send one single dollar to a program that does not support our clearly defined national interests. That's why I again thank you, Chairman, for your excellent work on the subcommittee and for working with the President and the Secretary to advance America First foreign policy. For context, the National Endowment of Democracy was created in Congress in 1983 as an independent nonprofit grant-making institution intended to strengthen democratic institutions abroad. Its core mission has long been to support growth of democratic institutions, civil society, free markets, and the rule of law around the world. I believe that overall, NED supports this vision. Its work in Venezuela, Iran, China, and Russia have been critical to supporting American interests against these hostile nations. However, NED has not been perfect by any means. In fact, NED's funding of the Global Disinformation Index, roughly $100,000, represents a serious lapse in judgment that demands accountability. And I think an apology here today, sir. The Global Disinformation Index did not simply study disinformation. It created tools that were used to blacklist and financially pressure media outlets. These tools were pointed directly at the American right and were a key component of the left's struggle to crush new media like the Daily Wire, Breitbart, and Joe Rogan. At best, this episode reflects a troubling failure of oversight. At worst, it suggests taxpayer dollars indirectly supported efforts that undermine core American free speech principles. The funding of such an organization is doubly concerning, given that NED's mandate explicitly forbids any programming within the United States. And that's why, sir, the vote on the House floor to defund NED was so difficult for some of us. I knew when I got on this committee that I was going to have to take tough votes. This was a tough vote for many of us. In fact, 127 of my Republican colleagues voted to defund NED. We have had to answer a lot of questions, and rightfully so, from our constituents of why we voted against this amendment and let the funding go forward for NED. I choose not to throw the baby out with the bathwater because I believe in the core mission of NED, but it's gotten off the rails. The American people deserve, my constituents deserve to know, and I think you've done some explaining here today. Again, I think you owe an apology to the American people. The Global Disinformation Index, in its name itself, is a 1984 George Orwell title for a follow-up to 1984. It's not an excuse in my book to say, hey, we caught it after the fact. What do you have to say to the American people about this?
We take this issue extremely seriously. As I said, we would never support censorship of Americans, suppressing any type of media in the United States. We do not fund anything related to U.S. democracy.
But the people you give money to did do that.
When we learned that this partner had undertaken that work, it is anathema to how we approach our work. It is inconsistent with our mandate. Providing 1,500 grants in over 90 countries around the world, often in modest increments, that's a lot of grants that we manage. If there is something that we determine is wrong, is a
Why did you
mistake,
catch it
we
going
address it.
before you gave the money to the Global Disinformation Index? How did you not know what they were doing?
When we supported that first originally, they had no work related to the United States. And what we were supporting was work taking place in countries around the world that were struggling with threats to their media environments. We helped them support the analysis of how the CCP was beginning to influence narratives, propagandas within societies in Africa and Latin America. We see this as a serious issue. We know that Russia and China have used and weaponized propaganda and information to try to shape narratives. This work, what we were funding, had nothing to do with the United States. At the time, at the beginning of their relationship, they were not involved in the United States.
All right, sir, we are out of time. Will you apologize to the American people for wasting their money on a program that went after right, truth-telling media in America?
We took immediate action.
Will
to
you
rectify-
apologize, sir?
We regret that we made this decision, and we actually have rectified it and held ourselves accountable, came up to respond to Congress and address it.
Well, if I gave that type of apology to my wife, I'd be out of the house. I yield back.
Thank you. Let me, a couple things. We keep hearing, and by the way, rightfully so, about, in essence, one particular major screw-up. You just mentioned that, I guess, it was originally meant for abroad, they weren't doing anything here, and then they started doing stuff internally in the United States. That's when you, in essence, cut their funding, correct?
That's correct.
I've heard folks mention that we should roll NED into the Department of State. I think that the Secretary of State has done a phenomenal job in really kind of, controlling the Department of State. But we had ample debate in this subcommittee about, in the previous administration, the Department of State funding things that were frankly not only not helping our national security interests, but potentially even hurting our national security interests. And as you all know, we had a debate in our committee where the Department of State had spent money on issues. I mean, they've all been, made very public, including, trans issues in Muslim countries, things like that. I don't remember the specifics right now, but we heard a lot of those. What we never heard from the Department of State, the previous Department of State, was either a correction or a defunding of any of those issues. And I think the one thing that makes NED different, well, a lot of things that makes NED different, is when you do hear and when you do find something that is against the mandate created by Congress, you act quickly. How long, roughly, because I've said days, but I want to make sure that I'm accurate. How long, roughly, between the time that you found out that this one grantee was doing things that were against not only the charge, but I would argue against our national security interests, how long, roughly, did it take for you to find it and correct it and defund it?
I became aware of the leadership on a Friday night, and by the following Thursday, we had completed our review. We had halted the grant immediately, completed the review by the following Thursday, met with our board and informed Congress of that decision.
And again, actually, that's I think the big difference. And one of the things that I've not said publicly, I guess a lot, but I've said it privately a lot. And during the Obama administration, and you kind of mentioned it in your opening statement, not about a specific administration, but during the Obama administration, when the Obama administration was basically giving concession after concession to all of the enemies of the United States. And let me talk about Western Hemisphere. When the Obama administration did this reapproachment to the Castro regime, asking nothing from the Castro regime, but actually was looking at helping fund that regime, et cetera. Correct me if I'm wrong. You all did not change your policy, your approach to how to deal with the anti-American terrorist regime in Cuba, did you? Despite, by the way, the fact that the Obama administration was looking at a totally different strategy.
We maintain that we have a responsibility to deliver on our congressional mandate, which gives us an exclusive focus on support for freedom and democracy consistent with American long-term interests. In Cuba, it was pretty clear that as long as a dictator was continuing to imprison their political opponents, to repress their people, to build a kleptocratic state that was a threat to the United States, that we would maintain as a priority our support for the Cuban people. Mr. Chairman, I think you've hit at an important point. We're built so that there is no such thing as mission creep from one administration priorities to another. We stay laser focused on freedom and democracy consistently over the time. The bipartisan structure, nonpartisan work helps us avoid getting into being pulled into issues that where they may not be a domestic political basis for support. We are not ideological. We do not promote social agendas overseas. And I think our ability to be able to focus on what matters to this committee, to members of Congress, that's why we're responsive. That's why members will have our cell phone, will come up the next day to brief, answer questions. We would never fund the issue of censorship, particularly anything related to censoring Americans. We would never do that. It's anathema to our being. What we have done is we've heard and we've listened about the importance of being responsive, getting oversight right, of being laser focused on what matters. And so our programming, we did an entire review of our programming to ensure that we are focused on piercing authoritarian censorship, that we're supporting freedom of expression, and that we are one of the most significant supporters of free speech around the world in a way that I think reflects fundamental American values, but the priorities that we've heard from members of Congress.
Ranking member?
Well, this has been interesting. Just so that, again, thank you for being there. That's what I love about this committee. We have very diverse views on some things, but we all do support democracy. And I wanted to just say that I think it's important to realize that democracy is a majority rule also requires protecting minority rights, and that's why I think it's so important that we have diversity, and that's something, of course, have a little bit of a conflict with the current administration. But what I want to ask you about is the authoritarian influences in the world, that we'll see what we can get through. Can you start with Iran? Because I know what we're seeing and hearing is horrendous, with thousands of protesters being murdered. Are you doing anything in Iran? And can you tell us what that is?
Thank you. Yes, we're seeing a grotesque tragedy unfolding in Iran as it brutalizes its people, tried to shut down access to information communication so that it could do this in private. This has been a huge priority for the Endowment. Iran has been, since I arrived at the Endowment, our fastest growing program. It's now one of our largest programs globally that involves both direct partners, Iranian groups, as well as our core institutes. If you think about the impact of our work in Iran, the reason the Women, Life, Freedom movement began with the simple act of a young woman who didn't fully cover her head with a headscarf. That story of Mahsa Amini could have been lost as a regional story in Iran. But NED partners helped cover that story, get it out to the world, and get it back into Iran. What we're seeing today, the Endowment has been making investments over years that have ensured that there have been secure communications, including Starlinks, other means, file casting, that allowed information to go both in and out of the country at a time when the regime tried to hide its brutal crackdown. We were able to pierce that censorship. We've seen very reliable estimates of these casualty figures around the world of what Iran is doing to its people, in part because the Endowment has invested over years in groups that have human rights networks across the country that have a very rigid, a very serious process for vetting casualty counts and being able to provide international media and others credible source of what's happened, documenting 17,000 deaths, upwards potentially of 30,000 remain under review by our partners right now. This is the type of work that I think is really important. At the same time, in a very difficult environment, the connection we can support between groups outside Iran, those inside, where it's very difficult to organize. And we've seen the engagement of business groups, of labor groups on the ground, of Kurdish political actors across the spectrum, working together on issues that are quite thorny and difficult for Iran's future. What does transitional justice look like? What could other constitutional arrangements be? It is a very repressive environment, and I think as long as the Iranian regime is cracking down on its people, we will be there by their side, that they know the American people support them. Part of what we see manifesting is a response that our partners have helped tell the Iranian people the story, that the regime has squandered their own resources on supporting proxies throughout the Middle East, to the point where they cannot manage their own water supplies for Tehran. And these stories have not just emerged, they are ones that have been covered, documented, and shared with the Iranian people consistently through our work.
Well, to me, Iran is especially concerning, not only because what they're doing inside their country, but the Iran with its proxies and its nuclear weapons and so forth, I think is a big threat to the world. I believe, Mr. Chair, that we just got a notification that the State Department is actually funding a new program to, I guess, with Starlink. Is that what it's called?
Yes.
Can you explain that?
I wouldn't want to speak on behalf of the State Department, but what I would share is that we've been investing in communication tools over years that allow for information to be sent into Iran even when internet connectivity is blocked. We specifically began supporting the deployment, the operation of about 200 Starlinks early on.
All right, you know what? I'm going to interrupt you. We better not talk about it. Okay, so
Good point, though.
that's a good point, though. Well, I think the point is, though, this is something that you've been trying to do, and I was just going to ask you one more question on this. In terms of Iran, what recommendation would you make for us in terms of any other things that we could do, either, let's say, peacefully or, with power, with hard power?
It's not my position to recommend a U.S. policy. I don't get involved in U.S. policy decisions. We understand what our role
Well,
is
how
and
can
how
we
to
help
play a
you?
support. I think the most important thing, it's what Dante Fascell, a member of Congress, said when NED was founded. If you don't like a dictator, continue to support their people. And I think one of the most important thing is right now we are hearing pleas of cries from the Iranian people to be able to determine their future, protect fundamental freedoms, and to do so in a way that brings together diverse communities across Iran. I think our support for the Iranian people, to know that in their darkest times, when people are imprisoned, when they have faced casualties, that those who have come to help support them, that have provided that aid, that assistance, are the American people. We have seen over and over again in people's darkest times, when they know that the endowment, and through the endowment, the American people have been with them, they become America's strongest partners and allies when they are no longer in the shadows, but are actually helping to shape the future of their societies. And I think it's important for the Iranian people to know that we stand with them.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Edwards.
Mr. Wilson, the report that I referred to earlier says that NED's total revenue increased from about $180 million in fiscal year 2019 to over $300 million by fiscal year 2022, and it characterizes that growth as unjustified. Can you explain what specific geopolitical or congressional priorities drove that increase, such as maybe support for Ukraine, countering other influences, or China-focused programming? And then also tell us whether those increases were tied to appropriated mandates from Congress rather than institutional expansion initiated by NED itself.
Thank you for that question. Yes, that's accurate. Before I came to the endowment, Congress was involved in helping to increase the endowment's budget, recognizing that the challenge to freedom had fundamentally changed. We have seen ups and downs, these third Democratic waves. We've been in a 2-decade of a Democratic recession. And what I understand from talking to members, appropriators that were involved at the time, a recognition that things had fundamentally changed by how authoritarian adversaries had begun perfecting repression at home, surveillance, technology, tools. We've seen that in the real expansion of repression inside countries. But second, began to export the tools, tactics, and technologies of that repression so that the policing techniques we saw in the streets of Minsk and Belarus, or the journalists that were even running news programs in Belarus directly from Vladimir Putin's Russia, the export of these tools, tactics, and technologies, turbocharged with China's export of surveillance technology, combined with the fact that we saw authoritarians now working together. You saw that in spades in Venezuela. We saw how Cuba has been at the heart of authoritarian resurgence in Nicaragua and Venezuela. We see that in Ukraine today. So part of this was to continue to give the United States, through the endowment, an expanded toolkit. And with that, Congress encouraged the creation of 2 mechanisms that the endowment introduced at the time. One was to recognize what became called strategic cooperation funds, that as we saw adversaries working together, that we needed to do a better job of seeing tried and true grassroots partners, but scaling them up, where they had proven track records to be able to connect, they could learn with others, and to be able to scale that to more strategic cooperation, so that those partners that might have had a breakthrough on one issue in one country, we could roll out to others. For example, we're doing that right now in artificial intelligence. How can that be used in a David versus Goliath way? And when we see partners that use AI in a way that advances fundamental freedoms, we have the ability to help connect across our portfolio so that learning doesn't stay only in the minds of that one partner, but can be spread across the ecosystem to give democratic forces a better chance. The second instrument is called contingency funds. And part of what Congress valued at the time is, unlike government agencies, we operate and can move money rapidly and quickly in smaller amounts. And so we have an ability to invoke a contingency fund when there is an unanticipated crisis or conflict or an opportunity. And those funds helped us respond, whether it was a war in Ukraine, a coup in the Sahel, or more recently in a place like Bangladesh.
Are there other funding sources for the National Endowment of Democracy, or are you 100% funded by what you get here from Congress?
We're predominantly funded by public funding. It's about 98% of NED's resources. We have modest private funds that provide support for some of our activities, our awards, things that are adjacent to our programming.
And what influence does that other 2% have on your agenda or the way that you operate the endowment?
It doesn't have an influence on the agenda. We operate according to a very clear mission that's set by Congress, and everything that we decide to fund through grants goes through a review process with our board, approval by the board of directors, which retains decision-making authority. Our priorities are set in consultation with Congress, not by outside supporters.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield.
Mr. Molinar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for this second round of questions. I want to talk with you a little bit about NED's work relative to China. And you've talked a bit about, the Uyghur genocide and that designation and the work that NED did. I'd love for you to expand on that because, a lot of American businesses are competing with companies that use slave labor in Xinjiang. And also some of our supply chains are dependent on that. And also, if you'd talk a bit about the surveillance, the national security laws that China and the CCP have put in place. You mentioned the police stations and some of the vulnerabilities that Chinese nationals, even on our home shore, are affected by. And if you could talk a little bit about NED's work in both of those areas.
Thank you, Congressman. First of all, I'd say that China is our largest program, and that includes work in the mainland and East Turkestan, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong, as well as Tibet, as well as our work addressing China's influence around the world. It's become our largest program because of the significance that it represents, both for the challenge to freedom and the scale of that. You've referenced a couple of key areas for our programming. We see the CCP's model that combines this element of economic coercion, as you've pointed out, with digital surveillance, forced labor, and this transnational repression. It's a suite of tools that has really actually made this work for support for democracy more difficult. And it's a model that has affected U.S. security, our supply chains, our businesses and workers. So in many cases, our partners have been involved in documenting the use of Uyghur forced labor, whether it's been in EVs, production of electric vehicles, solar. They have worked to document that both in country, getting that information out, which has actually helped inform the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, trade sanctions, has led to other countries in Europe, for example, also becoming more serious about their supply chains related to China. It's also been done by groups that we support that are Uyghur-led. So while their situation is still quite difficult, this is a form of power, giving them a sense of dignity to be able to help defend their own people in their own right. On the surveillance side, this has been most deeply concerning on the use of technology across the board. We've seen the export of surveillance technologies that have been used pretty expansively, even being able to pick up DNA, not just facial recognition, but being able to determine, are there Uyghur attributes? Part of what we have done in response is really to help seed a group of organizations around the world that are becoming experts in how the CCP engages in their own societies, so that whether it's in Africa or Latin America, that it's not Americans showing up and saying, beware of surveillance technology, beware of the strings attached to a CCP deal. We are now supporting organizations in Nigeria and Colombia where they can talk to their own parliaments, go on their own media, and explain why there's the risk associated with the relationship with the CCP.
And would you also talk a little bit about your work in Nicaragua? That's something that I know you've been involved there and certainly has a lot of importance as we think of our hemisphere.
Thank you for that question. I actually just recently returned from Costa Rica, which I made a priority for going there to try to visit our Nicaraguan partners. In the past 18 months, we have had 2 Nicaraguans, part of a freedom movement, assassinated in Costa Rica. A third was abducted, taken to Honduras, assassinated there. We have seen a burgeoning proliferation of the reach of Nicaraguan security services into Costa Rica. So I just went to the border of Nicaragua to meet with Ned's partners that bring together extraordinarily courageous folks to underscore our sense of solidarity in a time when they have pressure on them, even in exile. So Nicaragua, after Venezuela, Cuba, it's our 3rd largest program in the Western Hemisphere, reflecting the nature of a pretty extreme repression from the Ortega Murillo regime following their return to power. Our portfolio puts an emphasis on supporting independent media, access to information. We have an incredible suite of Nicaraguan journalists with coverage networks inside the country that ensure that Nicaraguans still know what's happening. We support those that are documenting both these crimes inside the country as well as the crimes that are happening outside of Nicaragua. We delivered a package of much of that documentation to Costa Rican authorities while we were there. We're also supporting groups that are remarkable, whether they are peasants, campesinos from the movement that resisted the Chinese effort to build a canal across their communities in Nicaragua. We've seen disaffected Sandinistas, former Contras, coming together, understanding the importance of nonviolence, peaceful resistance, and to prepare for a different future in Nicaragua. Religious freedom has been an important part of this program as well. in part by how the state has weaponized the church and has gone after faith-based leaders in the community as well as indigenous leaders. But finally, I'll just say, in many respects, it's also very personal work. All of credible candidates running against Daniel Ortega were all imprisoned. He tried to prevent what happened in Venezuela, coming together, have a democratic opposition, let's unify our forces against the regime. He put this to a stop by arresting all. One of those candidates, Felix Maradiaga, just to give you a sense of our relationships of trust, when he thought that regime forces would be coming for him, he wrote down on a sheet of paper a phone number, and he turned to his wife, Berta Valle, and he said, "If they take me, call this number, call Ned, they will know what to do." And so I think while we have lots of programs and projects, this long-term presence, it is the underlying relationships of trust that people know who we are, they understand how we've stood by them in difficult times. It gives us the ability to be relevant and supportive in very difficult circumstances.
Thank you very much, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Alford.
Thank you for this follow-up. Mr. Wilson, what was the original grant figure to the Global Disinformation Index, and when was that awarded?
I'll have to get you the exact details. The award took place before I came to the endowment. It was renewed since. I know it was, I don't have the exact details.
Did anyone know, your predecessors, do you have knowledge of anyone knowing that they dealt with so-called disinformation regarding climate change and COVID?
I'm unaware of those issues.
What guardrails have you put in place to make sure that this type of misappropriation of funds does not go to another organization like this?
I'd say a couple of things have been very important to us. Since I've come in, and even in an earlier conversation with the chairman underscored to me, I think in our first meeting, that the reason Congress is interested in supporting this work is because we don't have competing priorities. We don't do climate change, we don't do COVID, we do freedom. And that laser focus on the rigorous process of going through with our entire team, going through with our board. Is this a democracy project? Does it work on fundamental freedoms? Is it consistent with our mandate and mission? That discipline is a part of what we've helped instill.
What I'm trying to get to, did someone in NED know ahead of time what Global Disinformation Index was trying to correct information or control information, or did the correction come after they were awarded this grant? That's what I want to know.
I think what led to this grant was a truly difficult circumstances on how to deal with authoritarian influences and manipulation.
But did they overlook the other so-called misinformation they were trying to correct on climate change and COVID?
I'm just unaware of a climate change and COVID issue. For us, part of what we've also done in the wake of this, we have made it a point to say that we need to have visibility on the non-funded NED work that our partners are doing to assess whether this is a relationship we could have. And in that case, we would never fund that work, but if we had known they were funding that work, we would not have had that relationship with them in the beginning. And I think that's an important part.
Since being on the subcommittee, which I'm honored to be on, I've kind of seen a trend here in the last year. USAID, of course, moving most of the programs over to State Department. PEPFAR transitioning to, over several years, I think it's going to be transitioned off of the American taxpayers to other countries that have an interest in keeping that alive. World Food Program, we had Cindy McCain 2 weeks ago. She is transferring a lot of the responsibility to other countries and charities, trying to help even out the aid for that. And now NED, the potential of it being folded into the State Department. Would that be a good thing? If not, in your estimation, why not?
You know, I think the intent behind the endowment, the brilliance was to ensure that there was a private institution delivering for American long-term interests in a way that could be agile, flexible, and focused on democracy only. So I think the formula that our founders and our predecessors came up with is a brilliant one to give the United States an extraordinary toolkit that complements traditional foreign policy tools. I'd also say that part of what the endowment has done has worked to encourage those who have benefited from freedom to contribute to that cause. So we have worked to ensure that there is now a European Endowment for Democracy, a Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, so that those who benefited from American support in previous eras are now coming together to work with us to help ensure and invest in freedom and democracy so that it's not left as a burden for America alone, but those who have enjoyed freedom begin to pay that back.
Mr. Wilson, I don't want there to be any misunderstanding. I do appreciate you being here. I do appreciate your work. I'm looking out for my constituents. I'm looking out for the American taxpayers. There is a feeling in America, especially my district, that we need to be looking out for America first. And I've said this before, America first doesn't mean America only. That's why NED is important, that we can have a foothold in the world to spread democracy, truth, and hope for people who are suffering. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Mr. Scamani.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for sticking around here for second round of fun with us. I appreciate it. I wanna pick up right where we left off, which was on the list of grantees that we were discussing, and I had to step out so that you might have mentioned this, but I do want to go back to that and understand the privacy concerns in terms of the safety of the specifics, I guess, of the grantees. Now, some of that is disclosed publicly, not all of it. It is disclosed to your board. I think it's really hard to hold these tax dollars accountable from where we're appropriating. That's our job, to appropriate these funds and then add accountability to them if we can see that list. So at least, we should be able to see that. So if that can be made public to our committee, and then I would like to get that list and see where exactly that is going.
Yes, and let me make a distinction because we believe we're committed to full transparency with our oversight committees, with the executive branch. What we make a distinction is with public disclosure. So we marry the idea of full transparency in our operations and how we act with a duty of care to our partners to not put them at risk. And I think that is a very doable approach to ensure that what you're interested in, the chairman, others, have access to what we support. We publish the grants publicly. We provide each grant, how much it is, what it goes towards. What we don't do is provide personal identifying information.
I got that.
We can do that.
I understand that, but I need to see that.
Yes.
And then I'll determine what my thoughts are on that list after I
Yes.
see that list. So thank you for that. The other piece that I want to ask you here, and both the testimony and here you mentioned the requests and that are assessed for their strategic impact. That strategic impact and that strategy, is important to know where that's coming from. What strategy are you measuring it by? Is it the president's strategy on national security or another strategy? Because this has to match exactly, the renaming of this committee of national security. That is our main interest. Any dollar that leaves the United States to a foreign nation has got to serve the interest of the American people and our national security. That is the lens from which I see all aid that we are able to provide or push for democracy. It has to mean that it comes back to benefit the citizens of this nation and also our national interest in terms of security. So can you lay out what strategy specifically you're talking about regarding what determines your actions?
Absolutely. We develop our approach, our strategy in a way that is absolutely consistent with administration priorities and congressional priorities. We see it as important to be complementary to American foreign policy on these issues. And so the endowment has a strategy that's based on the reality of experience on the ground, but what is important for our country. It's why we prioritize our work in the authoritarian resurgent states. It's why we have investment in how to ensure that this technological revolution serves freedom, just doesn't undermine freedom. And it's why we're committed to ensuring that the United States is present in support of democratic forces in key bellwether regions around the world and a big geopolitical competition. Within that, our teams develop country strategies that reflect the reality of what takes place. We don't show up with cookie cutter strategies. We aren't imposing our views. We aren't importing our values or blueprints on top of another country's context. We're drawing from understanding of what's happening in that country to what will be effective to advance democratic norms, fundamental freedoms in that country and that strategy for itself. And then we have a means to come back and evaluate how are we doing against the strategy that we've set out to do. It's why when we report our spending plan to Congress, we lay this out in quite a bit of detail over how we'll spend over the course of the coming fiscal year. We come back and report, and with an annual report, how we spent that. And so we'll set out reflecting of administration, congressional priorities. That's why China's our #1 program. Asia's our largest investment.
I'm going
our
to
largest
jump in
growth
here,
in
and
Latin
sorry to interrupt.
America.
I've got 30 seconds left,
Yes.
and I want to be respectful of the time. I do want to thank you, Mr. Wilson, for being here, for answering our questions. I also will say that I feel like we spent a significant amount of time talking about the process, talking about explaining how we come to conclusions. I don't know that I'm fully satisfied on the exact measurements, metrics, and specifics of what I'm looking for my constituents to be able to justify whatever amount of dollars are being allocated for this program. I would like to have maybe another conversation once we see the list, and also be able to understand better in our next conversation specific metrics that you're using and specific results that you can point to of moving the needle in the right direction on this. Again, I think we talked a lot about process, but I would like to see more on results. But I do thank you for your time and the work that you do. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I'd welcome that conversation. I'd
Thank
love
you.
to come see you on that.
To the ranking member.
Thank you. Thank you again. I just, it's my understanding that for you to get the 2025 money that was appropriated by Congress, that you had to go to court for that. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. 2026 money, have you gotten that yet, or are you having to go to court for that?
We have not received FY26 yet, but we're engaged in consultations with the
As
administration on that.
who are you engaged with? Is it the State Department?
We've had regular interactions with
And
state
why
about this, and
are they
occasionally with
telling you,
OMB.
what are they telling you why the money's being held up?
We don't know. We don't have feedback from that yet. But following the passage of this committee's legislation, the appropriations, we're actively working to secure FY26 funds.
Well, I think, Mr. Chair, that's something that we probably should definitely look into. So, listen, again, I want to thank you, to hear these stories and to know what's going on in the people being political enemies being imprisoned by their autocratic leaders, masked men going into homes and terrorizing people. Certainly can understand why so many people are fleeing their countries. Unfortunately, it sounds very sad because it sounds like a story that's going on here. So what I want to end today, this has been a very interesting discussion today, and I want to thank you for trying to spread democracy throughout the world. I think that one day when we look back to what's going on in America, it will look like one of the darkest periods ever. What we're doing to people who've been here in our country, living peacefully for 30 years, being part of our economy, raising families, and now just without any due process, just grabbing them, masked men, unidentified masked men, sending them to detention, sending them to sometime to places they don't know, separating families, disrupting businesses. That's what's going on in the United States of America, and that is wrong. I hope that we can learn a lesson from Ned, and that we can really change this trajectory. But thank you so much.
Let me again thank the ranking member. Let me just close with a couple of thoughts. First, as Mr. Subcommittee said, we spent a lot of time talking about process. It is important that the steps that you have taken, and I'm aware of a number of them, to make sure that mistakes don't happen. And by the way, mistakes happen, unfortunately. The question is, how do you react to those mistakes? How do you how do you fix that and make sure it doesn't happen again? So, more details on that would be helpful, as Mr. Subcommittee said. I've had I've been able to get some of those details, but I think it's important that that's made more public about what you've done to correct any potential future mistake. I will tell you, I don't support any group, or any organization. I support accountability, transparency, and the national security interests of the United States. I have found, however, that NED is accountable, has a clear mission, and I do know how much we spend on NED, and I do know how much we spend on other democracy programs from this subcommittee. I don't know exactly how much China spends to spread their message, to influence partners and players and countries. I would imagine they're probably spending a lot more than we are. But it's important that we spend whatever we do effectively and efficiently and with accountability. So I think you play a major role there, and your organization plays a major role. But what you've heard today, right, is that this committee wants to make sure that every penny that we spend, this aren't money, is done so with transparency and accountability. And so I appreciate what you have done to make sure that you spend your money accountably and as transparently as possible. And I appreciate, by the way, that you've always been accessible to Congress and to this subcommittee, and know that we're going to continue to hold yours and the Department of State and everybody's feet to the fire, and I look forward to continuing to work with you. Let me now also mention that members obviously may submit additional questions for the record. Mr. Wilson, we will continue to work with you. We are not apologetic for protecting taxpayer money, but I will tell you that your mission, established by Ronald Reagan, supported by this Congress, continues to be as important now as it ever was, and we look forward to continuing working with you. With that, unless we hear something else from the ranking member, we will conclude this hearing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. Thank you.